The courtroom door slammed shut, a sound that ricocheted like a gunshot. Marcus Kane stood at the defendant's table, his dark eyes locked on the police officer charging toward him, her face twisted with rage. In that frozen moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the collision of prejudice and truth. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. A man who'd spent his life dodging stereotypes and breaking barriers, he now faced a courtroom that felt more like a coliseum, with spectators hungry for a spectacle. The officer, Deputy Sarah Connors, had been the one to arrest him 3 weeks ago, her cuffs biting into his wrists as she spat accusations of theft and assault. The charges were flimsy based on a grainy convenience store video and the word of a jittery clerk, but Connors had pushed the case with a zeal that felt personal. Now, in this overheated courtroom in downtown Atlanta, she was unraveling, her composure cracking as Marcus stood tall, unyielding. The trouble started when Marcus, a 38-year-old community organizer, had stopped at a corner store after a long day of mentoring kids in his neighborhood. He'd been buying milk for his daughter, Lila, when the clerk mistook him for someone else, someone who'd supposedly shoplifted the week before. Marcus had stayed calm, explaining the mix-up, but Connors arrived, gunslinger swagger in her step, and saw only a black man in a hoodie. The arrest was swift, humiliating. Handcuffed in front of his neighbors, Marcus felt the weight of a system that had already judged him. In court, the prosecution painted him as a thug, a danger to society. Connors sat smugly in the witness stand, her testimony laced with half-truths. He resisted, she claimed, her voice steady but her eyes flickering. He was aggressive, threatening. The jury, a mix of skeptical and sympathetic faces, scribbled notes. Marcus's lawyer, a wiry public defender named Elena Ruiz, dismantled the story piece by piece, but the real damage was done. Doubt lingered like smoke. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Connors, provoked by Elena's relentless cross-examination, lost her temper. She leapt from the witness stand, her face red, shouting, "You think you're above the law?" The courtroom erupted gasps, shouts, the judge's gavel pounding like a heartbeat. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood, hands clasped, his gaze steady, as if he'd been waiting for this. The bailiff tackled Connors before she could reach him, but the damage was done. The jury saw her rage, raw and unfiltered, and whispers spread like wildfire. What Connors didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was who Marcus really was. He wasn't just a community organizer. He was a former federal prosecutor, a man who'd spent a decade putting away corrupt officials and violent criminals before stepping away to focus on his community. He'd kept his past quiet, not out of shame but because he believed actions spoke louder than titles. But today, that past was about to roar. Elena, sensing the moment, called a surprise witness, Judge Amara Tate, a legend in legal circles and Marcus's former mentor. The room fell silent as Tate, a black woman with silver hair and a commanding presence, took the stand. She spoke of Marcus's career, his integrity, his tireless work to reform the very system now trying to crush him. "This man," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "has done more for justice than anyone in this room." Connors's face drained of color, her bravado collapsing as the truth landed like a gavel. The revelation wasn't just a plot twist, it was a mirror held up to the courtroom. The jury, once divided, now saw Marcus not as a defendant but as a man wronged by a system that judged him before knowing him. The clerk's testimony unraveled under scrutiny, the video evidence exposed as inconclusive. Connors's outburst became the case's turning point, a glaring admission of bias that no one could ignore. As the trial wore on, Marcus's story unfolded. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where cops were as feared as gang members, yet he'd chosen law school over despair. He'd prosecuted cases with a fairness that earned him respect and enemies. When he left the courtroom for community work, it wasn't a step down but a calling toe fix the system from the ground up. His arrest wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of a deeper rot, one he'd fought against his whole life. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, but it felt like days. Marcus sat with Lila, now 12, who clutched his hand, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride. When the verdict came, not guilty, room exhaled. Connors, ordered to remain for the ruling, stared at the floor, her badge suddenly heavy. The judge, a stern man named Hargrove, didn't stop there. He called for an investigation into Connors's conduct, citing clear evidence of prejudice. The crowd murmured, some cheering, others stunned. But Marcus didn't celebrate. He stood, thanked Elena, and walked out with Lila, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. "What's next, Mr. Kane?" one shouted. He paused, his daughter's hand in his, and said, "We keep fighting. Not for revenge, but for change." The trial's aftermath rippled. Connors faced suspension, her career teetering. The community rallied around Marcus, his story sparking protests and calls for reform. He didn't seek the spotlight but used it, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and mentoring kids like Lila who needed to see a path forward. The system hadn't changed overnight, but Marcus's victory was a crack in its armor, a reminder that truth could still break through. For Lila, the trial was a lesson in resilience. She saw her father not as a victim but as a force, a man who turned pain into purpose. Months later, at a community event, Marcus stood before a crowd, his voice steady but emotional. "This isn't about one man or one case," he said. "It's about all of us, black, white, young, old, demanding a system that sees us for who we are, not what it assumes." The wooden gavel from the courtroom, now displayed in Marcus's office, bore the carved words, "Justice or Prejudice." It wasn't just a relic, it was a challenge. Every day, Marcus answered it, not with anger but with hope, knowing the fight was far from over but believing, deeply, that it was worth it. The weeks following the trial were a storm. Marcus Kane, once a quiet force in his Atlanta neighborhood, became a reluctant symbol. His face appeared on local news, then national outlets, his story dissected by pundits and amplified by activists. The grainy courtroom footage of Deputy Sarah Connors lunging at him looped endlessly online, sparking hashtags and heated debates. Justice for Marcus trended, but so did Back the Badge, splitting the city into camps that saw the same event through wildly different lenses. Marcus didn't want the fame, but he couldn't escape it. Every step he took now carried the weight of a movement. Lila, his daughter, felt it too. At school, kids whispered as she passed, some with admiration, others with sneers. "Your dad's a hero," one friend said, but another muttered, "He just got lucky." Lila, wise beyond her 12 years, kept her head high, but Marcus saw the toll it took. At night, when the house was quiet, she'd ask, "Dad, why do people hate us for telling the truth?" He'd pull her close, searching for words that didn't feel hollow. "Because truth scares people," he'd say. "It makes them face things they'd rather ignore." Marcus returned to his community work with renewed fire. His nonprofit, Rise Up Atlanta, had always focused on mentoring kids and bridging gaps between police and residents. Now, it was a lightning rod. Donations poured in, but so did threats. Letters arrived, some calling him a hero, others slurring him with venom that made his stomach turn. He read them all, not out of masochism but to understand the divide he was trying to heal. One evening, sorting through the mail, he found an unsigned note, "You're tearing this city apart. Stop before it's too late." He stared at it, then set it aside. Fear wasn't new to him, neither was resolve. The city, meanwhile, grappled with its own reckoning. Connors's suspension became a flashpoint. Her defenders, mostly fellow officers and their supporters, rallied outside the precinct, claiming she was a scapegoat, unfairly targeted for doing her job. "She made a mistake," one protester shouted to a news camera. "She doesn't deserve to lose everything." Others saw it differently. At a town hall, a young black woman stood up, voice shaking but clear, "She didn't just make a mistake. She saw a black man and decided he was guilty. That's not a mistake, it's a choice." The room erupted, half in applause, half in boos. Marcus, watching the live stream, felt the familiar ache of a city pulling itself apart. He decided to act. Partnering with Elena Ruiz, his lawyer, Marcus organized a community forum at a local rec center. The goal was simple but ambitious: get people talking, not shouting. He invited everyone: residents, police, activists, even Connors' supporters. The night of the event, the gym was packed, the air thick with tension. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of nervous anticipation. Marcus stood at a podium, his voice steady but warm. "We're not here to point fingers," he began. "We're here to listen. If we can't do that, nothing changes." The first hour was chaos. Voices overlapped, accusations flew. A retired cop stood, red-faced, insisting the system wasn't broken, just misunderstood. A black teenager countered, recounting how he'd been stopped and frisked 3 times in a month for looking suspicious. Marcus moderated, guiding the conversation back when it veered into shouting matches. Slowly, something shifted. People began to share stories, not just arguments. A white officer admitted he'd never questioned the racial profiling stats until now. A grandmother spoke of her grandson, killed in a police shooting years ago, her voice breaking the room's defenses. By the end, no one had changed their minds completely, but they'd heard each other. It was a start. Connors, absent from the forum, faced her own crucible. The investigation into her conduct dug deep, uncovering a pattern: disproportionate arrests of black men, complaints of excessive force swept under the rug. Her personnel file, leaked to the press, painted a picture of an officer whose biases had festered unchecked. She hired a lawyer, issued a public apology that felt scripted and hollow. "I regret my actions in the courtroom," she read, eyes downcast. "I'm committed to doing better." Few believed her, but Marcus did something unexpected. He reached out through a mutual contact, offering to meet privately. Not to forgive her, he told Elena, but to understand her. The meeting happened at a quiet diner, far from cameras. Connors arrived, pale and guarded, her uniform replaced by a plain sweater. Marcus sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Why me?" he asked simply. For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers twisting a napkin. Then, haltingly, she spoke. "I saw you that night, and I assumed. I don't know why. I just did." It wasn't an excuse, and Marcus didn't let her off the hook. He pressed her, asking about her training, her fears, the moments that shaped her instincts. She admitted to burnout, to a culture in her precinct that rewarded snap judgments over reflection. It wasn't absolution, but it was raw. Marcus listened, not softening but absorbing. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said finally. "But you can choose what you do next." Connors resigned a week later. Her letter cited personal reasons, but rumors swirled that the department had pushed her out to avoid more scrutiny. Marcus didn't celebrate. He knew one resignation wouldn't fix the system, just as one trial wouldn't erase centuries of distrust. But he saw an opening. With Elena's help, he proposed a citywide training program, one that paired community leaders with police recruits to confront bias head-on. The mayor, sensing a PR win, backed it. The program, dubbed Bridge the Divide, launched with skepticism but gained traction. Officers who'd once scoffed at sensitivity training began to listen, some grudgingly, others with genuine curiosity. Marcus led by example, sharing his story not as a victim, but as a man who'd seen both sides of the law and still believed in its potential. Lila became his shadow in this work. She started a youth council at Rise Up Atlanta, giving kids a platform to speak on issues from school safety to police encounters. At one meeting, she stood before a room of teens, her voice steady like her father's. "We don't have to wait to fix things," she said. "We start now." Marcus watched from the back, his chest tight with pride. She was his why, the reason he kept going when exhaustion crept in. Months later, the city felt different, not healed, but hopeful. Protests grew smaller, replaced by conversations in churches, barbershops, and community centers. The convenience store clerk, shaken by the trial, retrained his staff and posted a sign, "All are welcome." It was small, but it mattered. Marcus's program expanded, drawing interest from other cities. He spoke at conferences, always bringing Lila, always ending with the same message: justice isn't a verdict. It's what we build together. The gavel from the courtroom, still in Marcus's office, became a touchstone. Visitors would trace the carved words, justice or prejudice, and ask what it meant. Marcus would smile, tired but resolute. "It's a question we all have to answer," he'd say. Every day. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But Marcus Kane, a man who'd stared down a system and walked away stronger, had lit a spark. It wasn't perfect, wasn't final, but it was real. And in a world quick to divide, that was enough to keep going. What do you think? Where does justice begin, and how do we bridge the gaps that tear us apart?